My wedding was perfect, until a stranger stood up and destroyed everything with 3 photographs. The chapel went silent. Even the violinist stopped playing. I stood frozen at the altar, my fingers locked around my bouquet, while every guest slowly turned toward the back of the church. A man I had never seen before stepped inside. Rain dripped from his dark coat onto the white marble floor. His breathing was heavy, like he had run for miles to get there, and in his shaking hand were photographs. If anyone objects to this marriage, the pastor had said only seconds earlier, speak now or forever hold your peace. The stranger lifted the photos. I object. A murmur spread through the room. My fiancé Daniel stiffened beside me. His face lost all color. And in that moment, before anyone even spoke another word, I knew something was terribly wrong. Because Daniel never got nervous. Not once in the 3 years I had known him. Not when he pitched million-dollar projects. Not when his father had surgery, not even when our flight almost crashed during turbulence over Chicago. But now, he looked terrified. The stranger walked slowly down the aisle. My mother, G, grabbed my arm. Emily, she whispered urgently, do you know him? I shook my head. The stranger stopped only a few feet away from us. Then he looked directly at Daniel. You told her you'd never met me. Daniel swallowed hard. Please, he muttered. Not here. Gasps erupted across the chapel. I stared at him. Daniel, what is happening? He wouldn't look at me. The stranger held out the photographs toward me. My name is Marcus, he said quietly. And before you marry him, you deserve the truth. My hands trembled as I took the photos. The first image showed Daniel standing beside a hospital bed. Beside him was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, smiling despite tubes running from her arms. The second photo showed Daniel hugging the child. The third one shattered me completely. It was a birth certificate. Father's name, Daniel Harper. I looked up slowly. You have a daughter? The room exploded into whispers. Daniel closed his eyes. I can explain. Explain. My voice cracked. You told me you never wanted kids. Marcus stepped forward carefully. She's dying, he said. The chapel became silent again. What? Marcus's voice softened. My niece, Fee has leukemia. Daniel is her father. I felt dizzy. Daniel finally spoke. She was born before I met you. Then why hide her? Because. He paused, ashamed. Because I was a coward. Every word hit me like broken glass. He finally faced me fully. I was 19. Sophie's mother died after childbirth. I panicked. Marcus and his family raised her. I sent money, but I stayed away. I could barely breathe. And now, Marcus looked at me sadly. Sophie asked for him. Daniel's voice broke. She found out last month that her treatment stopped working. A few guests wiped tears from their eyes. Even my father looked shaken. Marcus continued quietly. She doesn't want money. She wants her dad. I stared at Daniel. This man I thought I knew better than anyone suddenly looked like a stranger, but underneath the fear in his eyes, I also saw regret. Real regret. I tried to tell you, he whispered. So many times. Then why didn't you? Because I thought if you knew the truth, you'd leave. I looked down at my wedding dress, at the flowers, at the hundreds of carefully planned details that suddenly meant nothing. Then I thought about a little girl in a spittle bed asking for her father, and my anger shifted into something heavier. Heartbreak. The pastor quietly stepped aside. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their phones anymore. It no longer felt like a wedding. It felt like a moment where several lives were hanging by a thread. I turned toward Marcus. Why come here like this? Because he stopped answering calls, Marcus admitted. And Sophie's getting worse. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I was scared. Marcus nodded bitterly. Yeah. We noticed. For a long moment, all I could hear was rain tapping against the stained glass windows. Then I slowly removed my engagement ring. The guests gasped softly again. Daniel's face collapsed. But instead of handing it back, I placed it gently in his palm and closed his fingers around it. You need to go see your daughter. He looked stunned. Emily. Now. Tears rolled down his face instantly. I don't deserve you. No, I whispered honestly. Not right now. You don't. He lowered his head in shame. Then something unexpected happened. My grandmother, who almost never spoke in public, stood from the front row. She looked directly at Daniel. Being a fae, they start with showing up. The entire room stayed silent. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he turned and walked out of the chapel with Marcus. still wearing his tuxedo, still covered in shame, still carrying the ring, and somehow I knew that was the first honest thing he'd done in years. The wedding guests slowly began leaving. Some hugged me, some cried, some avoided eye contact entirely, but I stayed there alone near the altar long after everyone left, staring at the candles, at the empty aisle, at the life I thought I was about to begin. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my apartment eating takeout straight from the carton when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something told me not to. Hello? For a second there was only static. Then a tiny voice spoke softly. Are you Emily? My heart stopped. Yes, this is Sophie. I sat upright immediately. Her voice sounded weak but cheerful. I just wanted to say thank you. I swallowed hard. For what? For sending my dad. Tears instantly filled my eyes. In the background I heard Daniel laughing softly about something. A happy laugh. Not the polished fake corpora tea laugh I used to hear at business dinners. A real one, Sophie continued. He reads to me every night now. I covered my mouth, trying not to cry. He says he was stupid before. I laughed weakly through tears. Yeah, I whispered. He was, she giggled. Then she asked something that shattered me completely. Did you really wear a princess dress? I looked down at the wedding gown box sitting untouched in the corner of my apartment, and for the first time since the wedding, I smiled. A very big one, I told her. Dad says you're the bravest person he knows. I closed my eyes. No, I whispered softly. I think your dad is finally trying to be. 3 months after my wedding collapsed, I learned something painful about heartbreak. The world doesn't stop just because yours does. Bills still arrive. Friends still get engaged. Couples still hold hands in grocery stores like love is easy. And somehow, morning still comes. I had moved out of the apartment Daniel and I once shared and rented a small studio above a bookstore in Boston. It was quiet, lonely, safe. Most nights I buried myself in work just to avoid thinking, but no matter how hard I tried, I keep thinking about Sophie, about her tiny voice, about the way she called my wedding dress a princess gown, and about Daniel. I hated that part, because after what he did, I should have erased him from my heart completely. Instead, he somehow stayed there, broken, human, complicated. One snowy evening in December, I came home carrying coffee and groceries when I noticed an envelope taped to my apartment door. No stamp, no address, just my name written carefully across the front, Emily. My stomach tightened instantly. I opened it inside. One photograph slipped out. It was Sophie. Her head was wrapped in a pink scarf, but she was smiling brightly while holding a huge drawing. And written across the paper in crooked crayons were the words, "Thank you for giving me my dad." I stared at the photo for nearly a minute before noticing the note attached behind it. Emily, I know I have no right to contact you, but Sophie wanted you to have this. She talks about you constantly. Treatment is helping more than doctors expected. I don't know what happens next, but because of you, I wake up every day knowing I got another chance to become the father she deserves. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn that chance. Daniel voiced the letter 3 times. Then I cried harder than I had cried on my wedding day, not because I still loved him, but because people rarely change. And somehow, he actually was. Weeks passed. Christmas arrived. Boston turned into a city of lights and snow-covered sidewalks. My co-workers invited me to parties. My mother kept trying to set me up with nice men who don't hide children. Life was slowly moving again. Then, 2 days before New Year's Eve, my phone rang unexpectedly. Marcus, I answered immediately. Is Sophie okay? There was a pause. Then Marcus laughed softly. She's asking for you. Relief nearly made my knees weak. What happened? She refuses to start movie night without you. I blinked. What? She made Daniel watch Princess and the Frog 6 times because she said you'd like it. I couldn't help laughing. Marcus became quieter. She misses you, Emily. I didn't know what to say. Because the truth was, I missed her too. An hour later, I found myself standing outside the children's hospital holding a bag full of snacks, stuffed animals, and coloring books. I told myself, if it was just for Sophie, nothing more. But the second I stepped into her room, everything changed. Emily, Sophie practically launched herself off the bed despite the IV attached to her arm. I rushed forward laughing. Careful. She hugged me tightly anyway. You came! Of course I came. Daniel stood near the window, frozen in shock. He looked different, healthier somehow. Not because life had become easier, but because he finally looked honest. His expensive watches were gone. The arrogant edge in his voice had disappeared. Even his posture felt different, like guilt had humbled him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie grabbed both our hands dramatically. "Good," she announced proudly. "Now it feels normal." Daniel and I exchanged an awkward look. Marcus nearly choked, trying not to laugh from the hallway. That night, the four of us watched movies in Sophie's hospital room while snow fell outside the windows. For the first time in months, I forgot to be angry. Sophie made us play ridiculous board games. She forced Daniel to wear a plastic princess tiara. She even made me sing karaoke badly while nurses recorded it laughing. And for a feature, precious hours, the hospital room stopped feeling sad. Around midnight, Sophie finally fell asleep holding my hand. Daniel quietly placed a blanket over her. Then we stepped into the hallway together, alone. The silence between us felt heavy. "I didn't expect you to come," he admitted softly. "I didn't either." He nodded slowly. "You look happier." I almost laughed at that. "I live above a bookstore and eat instant noodles 4 nights a week." A tiny smile appeared on his face. "That's not what I meant." The hallway lights reflected tired shadows beneath his eyes. "You changed," I admitted quietly. He looked down. "Sophie changed me." "No," I said softly. "Losing her almost did." That truth hit hard. I saw it in his face instantly. He leaned against the wall. "You know what scares me most?" "What?" "That she became sick before I became a real father." Emotion tightened his voice. "And if she survives this, she'll still remember I abandoned her first." I looked towards Sophie sleeping peacefully through the hospital window, then back at him. "She'll remember you came back." His eyes filled with tears again. "You still see good in me after everything." "I did?" I crossed my arms tightly. "No," I admitted honestly. "I see someone trying, Don." For a long second, neither of us moved. Then suddenly hospital alarms exploded down the hallway. Nurses ran past us. Doctors shouted instructions. And inside Sophie's room, machines began screaming. "Sophie!" Daniel sprinted into the room before the doctors could stop him. Everything happened at once. Nurses rushed around the bed. Machines beeped violently. One doctor pushed us back while another checked Sophie's monitors. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought I might faint. "What's happening?" Daniel shouted. The doctor didn't answer immediately. "Sophie, sweetheart, stay with me, okay?" Her tiny body trembled beneath the blankets. I had never seen fear like that before. Not in movies. Not in real life. Not even at my ruined wedding. Because this fear wasn't about embarrassment or heartbreak. This was the kind of fear that steals the air from your lungs. Daniel looked completely shattered. He kept trying to move closer, but nurses held him back gently. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "That's my daughter." My chest tightened, hearing "Hi." Say it. My daughter. Not hidden, not denied, not avoided, claimed. Finally, after what felt like forever, the machines slowly calmed. The room became quieter. One nurse exhaled in relief. The doctor turned toward us. "She's stable." Daniel nearly collapsed. I grabbed his arm instinctively before he hit the floor. For a second, he just stood there trembling. Then he covered his face and cried silently, not caring who saw, not caring how broken he looked. Marcus rested a hand on his shoulder. And strangely, nobody judged him anymore. Because guilt changes people, but love changes them even more. An hour later, Sophie was asleep again. The doctors explained it had been a reaction to treatment complications. "She's fighting hard," one doctor said carefully. "Very hard." Daniel sat beside her bed holding her tiny hand like letting go would destroy him. I watched quietly from the corner. Then Sophie stirred slightly. Her eyes opened halfway. "Daddy?" Daniel leaned forward instantly. "I'm here, baby. Don't cry anymore." That nearly destroyed everyone in the room. Even Marcus looked away, wiping his eyes. Sophie turned her head slowly toward me. "Emmy." "Lie?" I moved closer immediately. "Yes, you stayed." I smiled softly despite tears burning my eyes. "Yeah," I whispered. "I stayed." Her small fingers reached toward mine weakly, so I held her hand until she fell asleep again. Around 3 a.m., Marcus finally convinced me to go get coffee from the hospital cafe. Daniel followed quietly behind me. Neither of us spoke while waiting in line. The exhaustion between us felt enormous. Finally, he spoke first. You shouldn't have had to see that. I stared down at the coffee machine. She shouldn't have had to live through it. He nodded painfully. You're right. We sat near the empty hospital windows while snow covered the parking lot outside. The city looked peaceful, completely unaware that lives were changing inside this building. Daniel rubbed his tired face. I used to think success meant never failing. I stayed silent. My father raised me that way. Perfect grades, perfect career, perfect image. He laughed bitterly. Perfect lies. I looked at him carefully. And now? He stared toward Sophie's floor upstairs. Now I'd trade everything just to hear her laugh at one more bad joke. His voice cracked again. For the first time I truly understood something. Daniel had spent years running from guilt, but now he was trapped in a battle where money, status, and pride meant absolutely nothing. Only love mattered, and love terrified him because it could be lost. I hated you, I admitted quietly. He swallowed hard. I know, but every time Sophie smiles at you, I paused. I hate you a little less. He looked stunned by that honesty. You don't owe me forgiveness. No, I said softly. I don't. Silence settled between us again. Then he reached carefully into his coat pocket. I still carry it. Before I could ask what he meant, he opened his hand. My engagement ring. I stared at it silently. I tried to throw it away, he admitted. 3 times. I looked up. Why didn't you? His eyes met mine fully. Because losing you was the consequence I deserved. Emotion tightened my chest instantly. Before I could respond, footsteps approached quickly. Marcus. But his face looked pale, very pale. Daniel stood immediately. What happened? Marcus looked directly at me first, then at Daniel. Sophie asked the nurse something. Daniel frowned. What? Marcus hesitated, then finally whispered. She asked if you two were still getting married. The words hit like a physical blow. Daniel looked completely shattered again. I couldn't breathe for a second. Marcus continued quietly. She said she wants to be the flower girl when she gets better. Nobody spoke. The silence hurt too much. Finally, Daniel shook his head slowly. She deserves the truth. But Marcus looked at me carefully. No, he said softly. She deserves hope. I closed my eyes. Because somehow, that was even harder. The next morning, I woke up in a hospital chair with Sophie's tiny hand still wrapped around my fingers. For a moment, I forgot everything. The broken wedding, the lies, the heartbreak. Then I saw Daniel asleep beside her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his head resting awkwardly near Sophie's blanket, like he'd refused to leave her side all night. And suddenly, nothing felt simple anymore. Sophie opened her eyes slowly and smiled. You're both here. Her voice sounded weak but happy. Daniel woke instantly. Morning, princess. She frowned dramatically. I had a dream. Daniel kissed the top of her head gently. Good or bad? Both. I smiled softly. What happened? In the dream, Sophie said seriously. You two got married. Daniel and I exchanged a quick awkward glance. But then, she continued, it started raining cake. I laughed before I could stop myself. Daniel laughed too. And for a tiny moment, we sounded like a family. That realization scared me more than anything. Later that afternoon, Sophie's doctor asked to speak privately with Daniel and Marcus. I stayed behind in the room helping Sophie color cartoon princesses while pretending not to panic. But the second Daniel returned, I knew the news wasn't good. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. Sophie noticed too. What did the doctor say? Daniel forced a smile that completely broke my heart. They said you're very brave. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. That's adult code for bad news. I nearly choked. Daniel laughed weakly. You're too smart. Sophie looked between us quietly. Then she asked the question none of us were prepared for. Am I dying? The room froze. No movie scene could ever prepare someone for hearing that from a child. Daniel sat beside her instantly. We're fighting, Dad boo. Am I? His lips parted. No words came out, because children know. They always know. Sophie looked down at her blanket. My friend Lily at the hospital said people start lying nicely when it gets serious. I saw Daniel completely fall apart inside. He grabbed her hand tightly. I wasted so much time, he whispered shakily. But I swear to you, every second now belongs to you. Sophie stared at him for a long moment, then quietly asked, even if I lose my hair again? Daniel actually laughed through tears. Especially then. She smiled softly, then looked toward me. And you? My throat tightened. What about me? If I get ugly and sick again, will you still visit? I immediately sat beside her bed. Sophie, I whispered firmly. There is absolutely nothing that could make me stop visiting you. Her eyes filled with tears. Then she suddenly hugged both of us at once with surprising strength. And that was the exact moment something shifted. Not romance, not forgiveness. Something deeper. 3 broken people holding each other together because life had cracked all of us open at the same time. That evening, Sophie insisted on walking through the hospital hallway despite being weak, so Daniel pushed her slowly in a wheelchair while I walked beside them. Nurses smiled as Sophie waved like royalty at everyone she passed. At one point she pointed toward the hospital chapel. Can we go in there? Daniel froze slightly, probably remembering our wedding disaster too. But he nodded. The chapel was small and quiet. Sunlight filtered softly through stained glass windows. Sophie rolled herself near the front pews. Then she looked at us carefully. Can I ask something? Daniel crouched beside her. Anything. If people really love each other, she said softly, why do they hurt each other so much? Neither of us answered immediately, because there was no easy answer. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly. Sometimes people hurt others because they're afraid. Afraid of what? He looked directly at me. Being seen completely. The honesty in his voice hit hard. Sophie thought about that. Then she asked me, do you still love him? Daniel immediately looked down, like he didn't even deserve to hear the answer. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, because the truth was terrifying. After everything, part of me still. I did. Not the old version of him, not the liar, not the man who abandoned his child, but this version. The exhausted father sleeping in hospital chairs. The man learning how to braid a little girl's hair from YouTube videos. The man who cried when Sophie laughed. Yeah, that man was harder not to love. Before I could answer, Sophie suddenly coughed violently. Daniel reacted instantly. Then came blood, tiny drops, bright red against her lips. Panic exploded again. Doctors rushed forward. Nurses grabbed equipment. And Sophie looked terrified for the very first time. Daddy, Daniel held her face carefully. I'm here. She started crying. I don't want to die. Every person in that chapel stopped moving. Daniel broke completely. No, he whispered desperately. No, 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 no. You're not leaving me. Do you hear me? I just found you. Sophie clung to him sobbing, and standing there watching them, I realized something horrifying. If we lost her, none of us would survive it the same way again. The next 48 hours felt like living underwater. Everything became slow, heavy, muted. Doctors moved quickly around Sophie, but every conversation sounded distant. Against me, like I was hearing it from the bottom of a lake. She's weak. We're monitoring internal bleeding. We need to prepare for every possibility. Every possibility. Those words haunted me. Daniel barely left Sophie's side. He stopped shaving, stopped sleeping, stopped pretending to be strong. And honestly, watching him love her so desperately hurt almost as much as the fear of losing her, because this was the man he could have been all along. One night around 2 a.m., I found him alone in the hospital chapel, the same chapel where Sophie had asked if I still loved him. He sat in the last pew with his elbows on his knees and his hands covering his face. For a second, I almost walked away. But then I heard it. He was praying, not polished, rehearsed prayers, not religious speeches, just broken whispers. Take anything else. My chest tightened instantly. Take my career, my money, my future, just not her. I had never heard pain like that before. He looked up slowly when he realized I was there. His eyes were swollen red. She finally fell asleep, he said quietly. I sat beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. Yo! You know what's strange? What? I used to think the worst day of my life was our wedding. I looked down. But now, he whispered shakily, I'd give anything to go back to that day, because at least she was still okay. Tears burned behind my eyes. He leaned back against the pew. I keep replaying everything. The lies, the lost years. Silence settled heavily between us. Then he asked softly, Do you know why I really hid Sophie from you? I looked at him carefully. Because you were ashamed. He shook his head slowly. No. His voice cracked. Because I thought if you saw the worst thing I'd ever done, you'd realize I wasn't worth loving. That sentence shattered something inside me. Because underneath all his mistakes was someone deeply convinced he didn't deserve happiness. And people like that often destroy the very things they love most. I stared toward the stained glass windows. You should have trusted me. I know. You made the choice for both of us. I know, Dot. You broke my heart. At that, his composure collapsed again. I know, Dos. The honesty hurt more than excuses would have. Then suddenly his phone rang. Marcus. Daniel answered immediately. Immediately. His entire face changed after only 2 seconds. Fear, pure fear. He stood so fast the pew slammed loudly behind him. What happened? I jumped up instantly. Daniel was already running before the call even ended. My heart pounded as we rushed upstairs together. Doctors crowded Sophie's room again. Machines beeped wildly. Marcus stood frozen near the doorway looking pale. And Sophie, she looked so small. Too small. An oxygen mask covered half her face. Daniel pushed forward desperately. Sophie! Her eyes fluttered open weakly at the sound of his voice. Daddy! He grabbed her hand immediately. I'm here! The doctor pulled Marcus and me aside quietly. She's asking for a family memory activity. I blinked. What? It helps terminal pediatric patients emotionally, the doctor explained gently. Sometimes they create goodbye memories. Goodbye. The word nearly knocked the air out of me. No, I whispered instinctively. The doctor's expression softened sadly. We're still fighting for her, but emotionally, she's preparing herself. I looked toward Daniel. He was kissing Sophie's forehead repeatedly like he could somehow keep her alive through love alone. Then Sophie motioned weakly toward me. Emily, I hurried to her bedside. What is it, sweetheart? She looked between both of us carefully, then whispered something so softly I almost missed it. Can we pretend today? Daniel frowned gently. Pretend what? Sophie swallowed weakly. That we're already a family. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel closed his eyes instantly, completely shattered. And somehow, I understood exactly why she asked. Because sick children don't dream about money, or weddings, or perfect lives. They dream about feeling safe before it's too late. I felt tears slide down my face. Then Sophie whispered one more thing. Just for one day. Daniel looked at me helplessly. Not demanding, not expecting, just broken, and waiting. I stared at Sophie's tiny, fragile face. At the little girl who unknowingly walked into my ruined wedding and destroyed every plan I had, only to somehow become the person I loved most. Then I took a shaky breath and climbed gently onto the hospital bed beside her. Daniel looked stunned. I reached for his hand. Come here, I whispered. The second he joined us, Sophie smiled for the first time all day. A real smile, peaceful, happy. She curled herself between us carefully while machines hummed around the room. And there, inside a hospital room full of fear and heartbreak, we became something none of us expected. Not husband and wife, not a perfect family, but 3 people choosing each other anyway, even if only for one day. For the rest of that day, we gave Sophie everything she wanted. Everything, no matter how small, no matter how ridiculous. Because when someone you love might be running out of tomorrows, you stop caring about pride, about awkwardness, about unfinished heartbreak. You just love them while you still can. Sophie made us eat terrible hospital pancakes together for breakfast. She forced Daniel and me to hold hands during movies because, according to her, real couples are legally required to. At one point, she even demanded a family selfie, despite Daniel protesting that he looked exhausted. You always look exhausted, she informed him seriously. Marcus nearly fell over laughing. The nurse took the picture anyway, and somehow, it became my favorite photo I had ever seen. Not because we looked perfect, we didn't. Daniel's eyes were swollen from crying. My hair was a mess. Sophie looked pale and fragile beneath her pink scarf. But the love in that picture, it was real. That afternoon, Sophie became unusually quiet. The playful energy faded. She leaned weakly against Daniel while he read stories aloud in different terrible accents just to make her laugh. I watched him carefully. Every time she smiled, relief flooded his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. Like he was terrified each smile might be the last one. Eventually, Sophie looked toward me sleepily. Emily? Yes, sweetheart? If I die. Daniel instantly stopped reading. No, he said sharply. But Sophie shook her head gently. Daddy, let me talk. His jaw tightened as he looked away, fighting tears. Sophie turned back toward me. If I die, will you stay with him? The room went completely silent. I felt Daniel freeze beside her. Sophie, I whispered carefully, because he gets lonely even when people are around. Daniel covered his eyes instantly. That tiny sentence broke him harder than anything else had. because it was true, painfully true. Sophie continued softly. And before you came, he looked sad all the time. I looked at Daniel, at the man who once hid behind expensive suits and perfect smiles, and suddenly I realized something devastating. He had probably been lonely long before he ever met me. Sophie reached weakly for my hand. Promise me he won't be alone again. Tears rolled down my face silently. Before I could answer, Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the window. His shoulders shook. He was crying again, quietly, trying not to let Sophie hear. I squeezed her hand gently. You should rest. But she kept staring at me, waiting. Children always wait for honesty. So finally, I nodded once and whispered, I promised. Across the room, Daniel completely broke. That night, snowstorm warnings covered the news. Most visitors left the hospital early, but we stayed. Of course we stayed. Around midnight, Sophie woke suddenly coughing again. This time worse. Doctors rushed in immediately. Her oxygen levels dropped fast. Everything became chaos. Daniel held her hand desperately while nurses adjusted machines. It hurts, Sophie cried weakly. I know, baby, Daniel whispered frantically. I know the doctors worked quickly. But I saw the fear in their faces now. Real fear. One nurse quietly asked Marcus to contact additional family members. My stomach dropped instantly. Number? No, not yet. Daniel looked completely panicked. You said treatment was helping, the doctor answered carefully. It was. But leukemia can become unpredictable very quickly. Sophie cried softly again. Then suddenly she looked toward the hallway. Mommy? Everyone froze. Daniel's face collapsed instantly, because Sophie's mother was gone. Had been gone her entire life. But sometimes near the end, people see things others cannot. Marcus turned away, wiping tears. I couldn't breathe. Sophie smiled weakly toward the empty doorway. She's here. Daniel buried his face against her blanket, shaking violently. And in that moment, I realized love can destroy a person far more than hate ever could. Hours later, Sophie stabilized again, barely. The doctors warned us the next 24 hours would be critical. Critical. Such a cold word for something so cruel. Around 4 a.m., I found Daniel sitting alone outside Sophie's room, staring blankly at the floor. He looked completely emptied out. I sat beside him quietly. After a long silence, he finally whispered, I'm going to lose her. The pain in his voice felt unbearable. I reached for his hand instinctively. He held onto mine immediately like a drowning man. I wasted 6 years, he whispered brokenly. 6 years she could have known I loved her. You're here now. That what if now isn't enough? I didn't have an answer, because sometimes love arrives late, and sometimes late still matters. But sometimes it also hurts forever. Daniel leaned forward, tears falling silently again. I don't know how to survive this. I squeezed his hand harder, and for the first time since our destroyed wedding, I pulled him into my arms. He collapsed against me instantly, completely shattered. And as I held the man who once broke my heart, I realized something terrifying. Somewhere along the way, he had quietly started healing it too. By sunrise, the storm outside had buried the city in white. The hospital windows looked frozen. Still, silent, but inside Sophie's room, fear never stopped moving. Doctors came and went constantly. Machines beeped in uneven rhythms. And Daniel never let go of her hand once. Not once. Around noon, Sophie woke up weakly. Her eyes searched the room slowly until they found us. Me, Daniel, Marcus, all there, waiting. She smiled faintly. You stay. Daniel kissed her forehead carefully. Always. Her breathing sounded heavier now. Each breath looked painful, but somehow she still tried to comfort us instead of herself. That was the kind of child she was. A nurse entered quietly carrying a small box wrapped in silver paper. For Sophie, she whispered. Inside was a hospital tradition called a bravery box. Children filled it with letters, drawings, or wishes they wanted their families to have. Sophie looked excited despite her exhaustion. I forgot. She opened it carefully. Inside were crayons, folded notes, and tiny objects she'd collected during treatment. A friendship bracelet, a toy crown, movie tickets, little pieces of her short but beautiful life. Then she pulled out 3 envelopes, one for Marcus, one for Daniel, and one for me. My hands shook opening mine. Inside was a drawing. It showed the 3 of us holding hands beneath a giant crooked rainbow. Above us, Sophie had written, "My family." I burst into tears immediately. Lie. Daniel couldn't even open his envelope yet. His hands were trembling too hard. Finally, Sophie looked at him. Daddy? He forced himself to smile. Yes, princess. Read yours. He slowly opened the letter, and then completely broke down. I had never seen grief hit someone so hard. Not even at the wedding. Not even during the hospital scares. This was different. This was a father realizing how deeply his child loved him despite everything. His tears fell onto the paper as he read silently. Later, after everything, he would show me what it said. It was only one sentence. Thank you for coming back for me. That sentence haunted him forever. Around evening, Sophie became weaker very quickly. Doctors spoke in quieter voices now. The room lights dimmed softly. Marcus stood near the corner crying silently. And Daniel looked terrified. Not dramatic, not loud. Just deeply, helplessly terrified. Sophie motioned weakly for him to come closer. He leaned down immediately. Yeah, baby, she whispered something none of us expected. You were worth waiting for. Daniel made a sound I hope I never hear again as long as I live. The sound of a human here. Tea breaking completely open. He buried his face against her tiny hands, sobbing. I'm sorry, he whispered over and over. I'm so sorry. Sophie gently touched his hair. It's okay now. Don't know. It wasn't okay. None of this was okay. But somehow, she still wanted peace more than pain. Then she looked at me. Emily? I moved beside her instantly. Her small hand reached toward mine again. Thank you for loving him when he forgot how. I couldn't speak. I just cried. Outside the hospital room, snow continued falling quietly over the city. Cars moved. People laughed somewhere. Life continued. Completely unaware that the universe inside this little room was collapsing, Sophie's breathing slowed gradually, then slower still. Daniel climbed carefully beside her on the bed, holding her against his chest. I'm here, he whispered desperately. I'm right here. And for the very last time, Sophie smiled. I know. A few moments later, the machines changed. One long sound filled the room. Flat, cold, final. Daniel screamed, not loudly. Not violently. Just one shattered sound of pure heartbreak that seemed to tear through every wall in the hospital. Marcus dropped into a chair, crying openly, and I stood frozen beside the bed, unable to breathe, because a little girl who loved princess movies and terrible pancakes and rainbow drawings was gone. The funeral happened 4 days later. The entire church overflowed with people. Nurses came, doctors came, families from the pediatric ward came. Even strangers came after hearing about Sophie's kindness. Children placed handwritten notes beside her flowers. One read, "Thank you for sharing your crayons with me." Another said, "I hope heaven has movie nights." Daniel could barely stand through the service, but he stood anyway, because fathers do that, even broken ones. After everyone left, we stayed behind near her grave while snow melted softly around us. Daniel stared at the tiny headstone silently, then finally whispered, "She made me a better man just in time for me to lose her." I slipped my hand into his quietly, and this time, he didn't let go. Months passed. Grief changed everything, but it also changed us. Daniel left his corporate job, started funding leukemia programs for children. Marcus joined him, and together they created a foundation in Sophie's name that paid for treatments families couldn't afford. The first hospital playroom they built had rainbow walls and terrible pancakes every Friday, just because Sophie would have loved that. One evening almost a year later, Daniel and I stood together watching children laugh inside the new pediatric center. Life still hurts sometimes. Actually, a lot of times, but healing had slowly started growing around the pain. Daniel looked at me quietly. "You know," he said softly, "our wedding was still the worst day of my life." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Really?" He nodded. "Because it was the day I almost lost everyone who mattered before I learned how to love them properly." Emotion tightened my chest. Then he reached carefully into his coat pocket. The ring. The same ring. He looked nervous this time. Human. Real. "No lies," he whispered. "No secrets. No running. Tears filled my eyes instantly. "I can't promise life will be perfect." I laughed weakly. "I think we already learned that." He smiled softly. "But I can promise you this," he whispered. "No matter how painful life gets, I'll never stop showing up." And somehow, that meant more than perfect ever could.